$650,000. Say that number slowly, and it sounds like security, a retirement, a future finally paid for. For Lynette Hooker, it was exactly that. 30 years of discipline sitting inside an AT&T 401k, untouched, growing, waiting for the day she'd finally stop working and start living. Now, picture a dinghy in the dark, a wife who goes into the water, a husband who comes back alone. That is the image the public was given. A tragic accident on a calm night off Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. A grieving man, an open sea, a story with a shape simple enough to close a file on. But what if that was never the whole story? This is not a video built on speculation. Every detail ahead comes from verified public reporting, official statements, primary interviews, and technical tracking data. What we're about to walk through isn't a theory. It's a pattern. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Here is what the world was told. Lynette and Brian Hooker, married, both former AT&T employees, sailing their boat, the Soulmate, through the waters near Elbow Cay. On the night in question, Lynette fell from an 8-foot dinghy into the ocean while moving between the boat and the shore. Brian says he searched. He says he couldn't find her. He says it was an accident, plain and simple, the kind of accident that happens on open water when the night is dark and the footing is unsteady. That's the shape the story took. Simple, contained, explainable. The kind of explanation that lets people stop looking. But true crime cases rarely stay that simple. Because a case like this, a disappearance at sea, no witnesses, one surviving spouse with the only account of what happened, depends entirely on one thing: whether we stop asking questions once we're handed an answer. Most people do. The story is sad, the ocean is vast and unforgiving, and the explanation is available and tidy. So the questions stop, the case gets filed under tragedy, and everyone moves on. Here, they don't. Because underneath the surface of a tragic accident sits a single figure that reframes everything that follows. $650,000. That number matters. Not because wealth implies guilt. It doesn't. Plenty of people have money, and plenty of marriages survive it. It matters because of what federal law does with that number the moment a spouse disappears. Under ERISA, the law that governs employer-sponsored retirement accounts in the United States, a legally married spouse is automatically the primary beneficiary of 401k, the full balance, no exceptions, unless a notarized waiver exists specifically relinquishing that right. No such waiver existed here, which means the moment Lynette was declared missing and eventually presumed deceased, that entire balance had exactly one legal destination: her husband. Now hold that fact next to another one, confirmed by a former coworker who knew the couple. Brian's own retirement account had already been drained, spent, gone by the time this voyage happened. Ask yourself the investigator's question. 2 accounts under one roof. One full, growing, decades in the making. One empty, already spent. What does an empty account do to the person standing next to a full one, especially when the law has already decided what happens to that full account the day its owner dies? That question doesn't answer itself yet. It doesn't need to. It just needs to sit there quietly while we look at what the people around this couple actually witnessed. Because motive alone proves nothing. Motive only matters when it's standing next to opportunity, and next to a story that doesn't hold up under its own weight. Start AT&T, where they met, where they built their careers side by side, and where colleagues had a front row seat to their marriage for years before any of this happened. Lynette was, by every account gathered from those who worked alongside her, the version of a person a workplace rallies around without being asked. Warm, organized, meticulous, even in her personal finances. The kind of colleague who remembered birthdays and mentored the newer employees without being told to. When she disappeared, colleagues didn't just send condolences. They organized in numbers, held memorials, demanded that her case not be allowed to quietly fade. That reaction alone tells you something about who she was to the people who knew her daily. Brian occupied very different territory in that same workplace. A former union steward, remembered less as a mediator and more as someone who tested boundaries, who understood the rules well enough to know exactly how far he could bend them without breaking. Former colleagues, independently, noted something else. Something small enough to seem irrelevant at the time, the kind of detail that only becomes significant in hindsight. He rarely used his wife's name in conversation. Instead, he referred to her routinely as the kid. That is not a small shift. Nicknames are common in marriages, but language is also where emotional distance hides before it becomes visible anywhere else. An habitual linguistic minimization of a spouse, especially one who held every financial advantage in a relationship, is the kind of detail investigators don't dismiss. Now follow the night itself, because this is where the official account starts to fracture against a physical record, where testimony meets timestamp, and one of them has to be wrong. Brian says he was out on the water, alone, in the 8-foot dinghy, searching desperately for his wife in the dark. But multiple independent witnesses stationed on Elbow Cay reported a distress flare fired into the night sky at approximately 8 p.m., and they were specific, unprompted, about where it originated. Not the low-profile dinghy drifting somewhere on open water, the deck of the Soulmate itself. If Brian was in the dinghy, searching the water as he claimed, who was on the sailboat launching a flare, a private security camera belonging to a nearby property owner, angled toward the mooring field, recorded something else entirely. Distinct light activity aboard the Soulmate at 7:47 p.m., 12:27 a.m., and 12:32 a.m. According to Brian's own account to authorities, no one was supposed to be aboard the vessel during any of those windows. He was supposed to be out on the water, and yet the footage shows a boat that was, by his telling, empty and dark, lit and occupied. Then there's the AIS, the automatic identification system every commercial and private vessel uses to broadcast its position, speed, and heading in real time. For a full month leading up to that night, the Soulmate signal was constant, reliable, unbroken. At 9:30 p.m., it went dark. It stayed dark for 11 consecutive hours, precisely the window during which a genuine search and rescue effort should have been broadcasting to every nearby vessel, and came back online at 8:30 the following morning, the exact moment Brian stepped back onto the deck, accompanied by Bahamian police officers. An 11-hour blackout, bookend almost perfectly by the disappearance on one side and the arrival of law enforcement on the other. That kind of blackout doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere specific, usually from someone who already knows how to make a tracking system stop talking. And in Brian's case, there's a documented history that makes the coincidence considerably harder to accept at face value. Years earlier, he was formally terminated from AT&T for manually tampering with the GPS unit installed in his company service van, specifically to obscure his real location during work hours. A man once fired for altering location data to hide where he was. Years later, aboard a boat whose location data vanished for 11 hours during the search for his missing wife. Both of these things are true at the same time. That could be coincidence. And it could be a demonstrated skill applied a second time, under far higher stakes. Now watch what happened in the hours immediately after. The Soulmate carried an aerial drone, capable of scanning the notoriously clear Caribbean water from above. Precisely the tool that gives a search its best chance of spotting a floating object, a life jacket, or a person in distress in shallow, transparent water. Brian had the technical skill to operate it. According to search records, at no point during the critical early hours did he suggest using it. He also placed a call that night to his stepdaughter, Carly. If your mother had just disappeared into open ocean, you'd expect a message defined by panic, by grief, by details of where the search boats were sweeping. Instead, Brian left a voicemail whose primary content was that he had successfully retrieved a flotation device from the water. Not a plea for help, not a location update on the search. A calm report about recovered equipment. And in a later 40-minute recorded telephone conversation, describing the exact moment his wife of years went into the dark ocean, Brian didn't reach for words like fell or slipped or was thrown or vanished. The words most people instinctively use when describing someone they love disappearing into danger. He said she bounced. She bounced. To investigators, journalists, and anyone who has since listened to that recording, the word lands with a specific kind of weight. It's not a word that carries grief. It's a word that carries distance. The language you'd use for an object leaving a surface, not a human being leaving a life. And once you hear it, it becomes difficult to hear the rest of his account the same way again. So here's where the threads meet. A financial motive with a legal deadline built directly into it by federal law. A timeline that physically cannot hold. A man supposedly stranded on a dinghy searching the water, while lights move on the very boat he claimed to have left behind. A tracking system disabled for exactly the hours that mattered most, operated by someone with a documented history of disabling tracking systems specifically to hide his location. A drone capable and ready, left untouched. A voicemail about equipment, where there should have been a plea about a person. And a single word bounced that strips a human life down to cargo. Brian Hooker is no longer just a grieving widower recounting a tragic night at sea. He is the visible end of something larger, a financial incentive with a hard deadline, a technical capability already proven once before, and a pattern of language that, thread by thread, points in the same direction. That possibility, even held only as a possibility, changes everything about how this case should be read. We have to be exact about where this stands, because precision is the only thing that protects a case like this from becoming a witch hunt instead of an investigation. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. He denies any wrongdoing. He maintains, publicly and consistently, that his wife's death was a result of a tragic accident at sea. Under the United States Constitution and international legal standards, he is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that presumption matters as much as any single piece of evidence laid out tonight. But presumption of innocence and a growing list of unanswered questions can exist in the same space, at the same time, without contradiction. Investigators are still working the financial trail, still working the 11-hour digital gap, still working the discrepancy between witness testimony and Brian's own timeline. What they currently know and what they can currently prove in a courtroom are not the same thing. And that gap, right now, is exactly where this case lives. Lynette Hooker was not a line in a missing persons file, and she should never be reduced to one. She was a daughter. A colleague people organized in numbers for. A woman remembered, specifically and repeatedly by name, while the man she married, by his own admitted habit, rarely used at all. She deserves more than a case that quietly closes under the word accident, simply because the ocean doesn't give up its evidence easily. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, or if you were near Elbow Cay, Bahamas, on the night in question, and witnessed anything unusual, please do not stay silent. Contact the Royal Bahamas Police Force through your local station, the United States Coast Guard Sector Miami Command Center at 305-535-4300, or submit a tip directly to the FBI at tips.fbi.gov. Some cases end in verdicts delivered in courtrooms, closed for good. This one, for now, ends in a silence that still hasn't been explained, and a family still waiting for someone to explain it.